Christian, I'm sure you heard what Carmen Reinhart was saying. You are here to talk with us about all the downgrades and your concerns about what's going to happen to sovereign debt, particularly in Asia, over the course of the year. What is your main focus, your theme for what is driving this?
Right. Well, as you had mentioned, we do have a negative outlook for 2021 for Asia Pacific sovereigns, and there's nothing new here. It does reflect the continuation of the stresses that we started seeing from last year. So indeed, the pandemic continues to drive our credit views for the region at large. Currently, we do have 6 negative outlooks, and those are more concentrated into in the frontier and emerging market space. So we also see a divergence in terms of how much longer or how sustainably governments can continue to provide stimulus, for example. So advanced economies are in much better shape, but frontier and emerging markets are going to have a little bit of more of a tougher time should certain event risks shape up. Now, we are still focused on the downside risks that are presented by the virus itself. I mean, indeed, as Ms. Reinhart had mentioned, we're 1 year later on, we're still looking at record high rates of infection in certain countries. In Asia, though, we do also see a divergence in the way the public health issues have been managed. And so a divergence in terms of the success. On one hand, you have places like New Zealand and Taiwan, which have done relatively well. And on the other hand, a lot of the emerging and frontier markets, I mean, we have India, Indonesia, we saw Malaysia announce yet another state of emergency. So here we do see a divergence in the growth outlook, also dependent on public health outcomes.
What about the ability to the countries that, say, are the poorer countries? It's going to be harder, perhaps, for them to keep selling bonds at affordable yields. Maybe they're the ones who didn't deal with the pandemic as well as others. Do you see any point where some of these governments are going to have trouble getting financing from the public markets, or at the very least being able to sell and service debt that they may have to sell at a much higher yield?
No, indeed, as I'd mentioned, we do see that divergence between advanced economies and developing economies. And most of our downgrades in 2020, and we do expect the same trends to continue in 2021, we're reflecting more constrained access to financing. So for many of the least developed countries, they are going to be relying on donors, on the international community. We've had the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the G20. We've had extraordinary lines of financing from the World Bank, the ADB, and other multilaterals. So as long as these lifelines continue, there is a sort of a backstop. At the same time, against that backdrop, the overall balance sheets continue to deteriorate, given the uncertainties with regards to the growth outlook, and given the uncertainties with regards to how much their balance sheets can recover.
Christian, do you see a financial crisis building in the way that Carmen Reinhart from the World Bank spoke to us about earlier?
Well, I think we would echo some of the same concerns. This is not perhaps a Lehman moment, like she said. We're not looking for a big bang, but certainly the pressures are continuing to build up. And once again, our negative outlook for the region is basically a continuation of the trends that we saw in 2020. So, constrained growth outlook, continued deterioration in the fiscals across the board. At some point, perhaps there could be some of these pressures could break, but certainly we're not looking at a financial crisis at the moment for Asia Pacific at large. When we talk about financial crisis, we are talking about the health of financial systems, and by and large, many of the countries that we are looking at entered into the crisis with very stable financial systems. There have been, of course, exceptions to that rule. For example, we downgraded India last year, and so the financial fragilities in the banking system, in the government's balance sheet, were exacerbated by the pandemic. So certainly, for many of the countries, apart from India, we are seeing that they entered into crisis with some buffers against the possibility of a financial crisis.
Is the issue also, you talk about an asymmetric recovery, right? And yes, economies like New Zealand, like Australia to a certain extent, have come out pretty well, well buffered in terms of economic growth and the recovery. But they're no China, right? So in the absence of another China with a strong recovery to be able to stoke the demand side recovery for other countries, is it really going to be difficult for a lot of these other economies that are reliant on that demand story to be able to get back on their feet?
No, indeed. We don't assume that the things will be back to normal. I mean, indeed, the past few weeks, I think there has been some enthusiasm buoyed by the introduction of vaccines, and in the region, some of that deployment has already started. But I think the fact of the matter is, we are not in a situation where we can see output levels, GDP levels coming back to 2019 pre-pandemic levels for most countries in the region. So in the absence of borders opening up, and tourism is a very important part of many of the economies in Asia, for example, investment for FDI relies a lot on the ability to travel. So investment and tourism are going to be handicapped. So I think countries are going to have to think of ways to domestic demand. And in many ways, that's going to involve a lot more fiscal stimulus. But domestic demand is going to be much more important in terms of thinking about how to continue to recover amidst the uncertainties related to the pandemic.